So thanks for that. And welcome to Class 7. Professor Jake, thanks for letting us record this, and please take it away.
All right, so we are at, in my book anyway, which is the 50th anniversary edition, we are on page 97. So we're just about almost halfway through the book. And he is going to visit the writer Sinclair Lewis's birthplace in Sauk Center, Minnesota. And so that's where we will begin. There was a sign in Sauk Center saying birthplace of Sinclair Lewis. For some reason, I went through there fast and turned north on 71 to Wadena, and it got dark and I pounded on to Detroit Lakes. There was a face before me, a lean and shriveled face like an apple too long in the barrel, a lonely face and sick with loneliness. I didn't know him well, never knew him in the boisterous days when he was called Red. Toward the end of his life, he called me several times in New York and we would have lunch at the Algonquin. I called him Mr. Lewis, still do in my mind. He didn't drink anymore and took no pleasure in his food, but now and then his eyes would glitter with steel. I had read Main Street when I was in high school. Has anybody out there read Main Street by Sinclair Lewis? Yeah, okay, Mary. And I remember the violent hatred it aroused in the countryside of his nativity. Did he go back? Just went through now and again. The only good writer was a dead writer. Then he couldn't surprise anyone anymore, couldn't hurt anyone anymore. And the last time I saw him, he seemed to have shriveled even more. He said, "I'm cold. I seem to be always cold. I'm going to Italy." And he did. And he died there. And I don't know whether or not it's true, but I've heard he died alone. And now he's good for the town, brings in some tourists. He's a good writer now. There had been room in Rocinante, I would have packed the WPA guides to the States, or all 48 volumes of them. I have all of them, and some are very rare. If I remember correctly, North Dakota printed only 800 copies, and South Dakota about 500. The complete set comprises the most comprehensive account of the United States ever got together, and nothing since has even approached it. It was compiled during the Depression by the best writers in America, who were, if this is possible, more depressed than any other group while maintaining their inalienable instinct for eating. But these books were detested by Mr. Roosevelt's opposition. If WPA workers leaned on their shovels, the writers leaned on their pens. The result was that in some states, the plates were broken up after a few copies were printed, and that is a shame because they were reservoirs of organized, documented, and well-written information, geological, historical, and economic. If I had carried my guides along, for example, I would have looked up Detroit Lakes, Minnesota, where I stopped, and would have known why it is called Detroit Lakes. Who named it, when, and why? I stopped near there late at night, and so did Charley, and I don't know any more about it than he does. The next day, a long cultivated ambition was to blossom and fruit. Curious how a place unvisited can take such hold on the mind, so that the very name sets up a ringing. To me, such a place was Fargo, North Dakota. Perhaps its first impact is in the name Wells Fargo, but my interest certainly goes beyond that. If you will take a map of the United States and fold it in the middle, eastern edge against western, and crease it sharply, right in the crease will be Fargo. On double page maps, sometimes Fargo gets lost in the binding. That may not be a very scientific method for finding the east-west middle of the country, but it will do. But beyond this, Fargo to me is brother to the fabulous places of the earth, kin to those magically remote spots mentioned by Herodotus and Marco Polo and Mandeville. From my earliest memory, if it was a cold day, Fargo was the coldest place on the continent. If heat was the subject, then at that time, the papers listed Fargo as hotter than any place else, or wetter, or drier, or deeper in snow. That's my impression anyway. But I know that a dozen or half the 100 towns will rise up in injured wrath to denounce me with claims and figures for having much more dreadful weather than Fargo. I apologize to them in advance. As a sop to hurt feelings, I must admit that when I passed through Moorhead, Minnesota, and rattled across the Red River into Fargo on the other side, it was a golden autumn day, the town as traffic troubled, as neon plastered, as cluttered and milling with activity as any other up and coming town of 46,000 souls. The countryside was no different from Minnesota over the river. I drove through the town as usual, seeing little but the truck ahead of me and the Thunderbird in my rear view mirror. It's bad to have one's myth shaken up like that. Would Samarkand or Cathay or Cipango have suffered the same fate if visited? As soon as I had cleared the outskirts, the broken metal and glass outer ring, and moved through Mapleton, I found a pleasant place to stop on the Maple River, not far from Alice. What a wonderful name for a town, Alice. It had 162 inhabitants in 1950 and 124 at the last census. And so much for the population explosion at Alice. Anyway, on the Maple River, I drew into a little copse of sycamores, I think, that overhung the stream and paused to lick my mythological wounds. So there is a great term, copse, meaning a little group of trees. Yeah, copse. And I found with joy that the fact of Fargo had in no way disturbed my mind's picture of it. I could still think of Fargo as I always had, blizzard-riven, heat-blasted, dust-rattled. I am happy to report that in the war between reality and romance, reality is not the stronger.
I'm trying to figure out where Alice is.
Although it was mid-morning. So now it's interesting that now whenever you say the word Fargo, generations of people just think of the movie
Yeah.
Fargo. And don't even really know what state it's in. Actually, I asked my students that once because they're like, oh, I love that movie. I'm like, you know what state it's in? And most people said Wyoming, Nebraska, Iowa. Although it was only mid-morning, I cooked a sumptuous dinner for myself, but I don't remember what it was. And Charley, who still had vestiges of his Chicago grooming, waded in the water and became his old dirty self again. After the comfort and the company of Chicago, I had had to learn to be alone again, and it takes a little time. But there on the Maple River, not far from Alice, the gift of it was coming back. Charley had forgiven me in a nauseatingly superior way, but now he had settled down to business also. The pull-out place beside the water was pleasant. I brought out my garbage can washing machine and rinsed clothes that had been jiggling in detergent for 2 days. And then, because a pleasant breeze was blowing, I spread my sheets to dry on some low bushes. I don't know what kind of bushes they were, but the leaves had a rich smell like sandalwood, and there's nothing I like better than scented sheets. And I made some notes on a sheet of yellow paper on the nature and quality of being alone. And these notes would, in the normal course of events, have been lost, as notes are always lost, but these particular notes turned up long afterward, wrapped around a bottle of ketchup and secured with a rubber band. The first note says, quote, relationship time to aloneness. And I remember about that. Having a companion fixes you in time, and that the present. But when the quality of aloneness settles down, past, present, and future all flow together. A memory, a present event, and a forecast, all equally present. The second note lies obscurely under a streak of ketchup or catsup, but the third is electric. It says, quote, reversion to pleasure pain basis. And this is from some observation of another time. A number of years ago, I had some experience with being alone. For 2 succeeding years, I was alone each winter for 8 months at a stretch in the Sierra Nevada mountains on Lake Tahoe. I was a caretaker on a summer estate during the winter months when it was snowed in. And I made some observations then. As the time went on, I found that my reactions thickened. Ordinarily, I am a whistler. I stopped whistling. I stopped conversing with my dogs, and I believe that subtleties of feeling began to disappear until finally I was on a pleasure-pain basis. Then it occurred to me that the delicate shades of feeling, of reaction, are the result of communication. And without such communication, they tend to disappear. A man with nothing to say has no words. Can its reverse be true? A man who has no one to say anything to has no words, as he has no need for words. Now and then appear accounts of babies raised by animals, wolves and such. It is usually reported that the youngster crawls on all fours, makes those sounds learned from his foster parents, and perhaps even thinks like a wolf. Only through imitation do we develop toward originality. Take Charley, for example. He has always associated with the learned, the gentle, the literate, and the reasonable, both in France and in America. And Charley is no more like a dog than he is like a cat. His perceptions are sharp and delicate, and he is a mind reader. I don't know that he can read the thoughts of other dogs, but he certainly can read mine. Before a plan is half formed in my mind, Charley knows about it, and he also knows whether he is to be included in it. There's no question about this. I know too well his look of despair and disapproval when I have just thought that he must be left at home. And so much for the 3 notes below the red stains on the ketchup bottle. Soon Charley moved downstream and found some discarded bags of garbage, which he went through with discrimination. He nosed over an empty bean can, sniffed in its opening, and rejected it. Then he took up the paper bag in his teeth and gently shook it so that more treasures rolled out, among them a balled up piece of heavy white paper. I opened it and smoothed the angry creases from its surface. It was a court order addressed to Jack so-and-so, informing him that if he didn't pay his back alimony, he would be in contempt and punishable. So again, Steinbeck went, and made this whole Lonesome Harry character in a hotel in Chicago. And now he's going to look at a court order from a guy and kind of do a psychological analysis on him as well. The court sat in an eastern state, and this was North Dakota. Some poor guy on the lam. He shouldn't have left this spore around in any case, in case anyone was looking for him. I snapped my Zippo lighter and burned the evidence with full knowledge that I compounded the contempt. Good Lord, the trails we leave. Suppose someone, finding the ketchup bottle, tried to reconstruct me from my notes, which actually did happen to him like 30 or 40 years after this book was written. I helped Charley sort over the garbage, but there was no other written material, only the containers of prepared foods. The man was no cook. He lived out of cans, but then perhaps his former wife did also. It was only shortly after noon, but I was so relaxed and comfortable that I hated to move. Should we stay the night, Charley? He inspected me and wagged his tail as a professor wags a pencil, once to the left, once to the right, and returned to center. I sat on the riverbank, took off socks and boots, and dipped my feet in water so cold it burned until the freezing went deep and deadened feeling. My mother believed that cold water on the feet forced the blood to your head so that you thought better. Time for examination. Mon Dieu, Shamal, I said aloud, which is another way of saying I feel comfortingly lazy. I came out on this trip to try to learn something of America. Am I learning anything? If I am, I don't know what it is. So far, can I go back with a bag full of conclusions, a cluster of answers to riddles? I doubt it, but maybe. When I go to Europe, when I am asked what America is like, what will I say? I don't know. Well, using your olfactory method of investigation, what have you learned, my friend? 2 complete wags. At least he didn't leave the question open. Does all America so far smell alike? Or are there sectional smells? Charley began to turn around and around to the left, and then he reversed and turned 8 times to the right before he finally settled and put his nose on his paws and his head within reach of my hand. He has a hard time getting down. When he was young, a car hit him and broke his hip. He wore a cast for a long time. Now in his golden age, his hip troubles him when he is tired. After too long a run, he limps on his right hind leg. But because of his long turning before lying down, we sometimes call him a whirlpool, much to our shame. If my mother's rule was right, I was thinking pretty well. But she also said, cold feet, warm heart. And that's a different matter. So at this point in his trip, Steinbeck is once again feeling kind of lonesome. His writing there was a little disjointed because he's just kind of left alone with his thoughts, and he's starting to understand that he doesn't necessarily understand what he's been learning on this trip. He goes away from that pretty quickly, but he's just letting the reader know that maybe this isn't going to be such a neat affair where he learns, this, and this, and he can mark that down for the reader. And maybe it's going to be a bit more difficult to get into what America really is. I had parked well away from the road and from any traffic for my time of rest and recount. I am serious about this. I did not put aside my sloth for the sake of a few amusing anecdotes. I came with the wish to learn what America is like, and I wasn't sure I was learning anything. I found I was talking aloud to Charley. He likes the idea, but the practice makes him sleepy. Just for ducks, let's try a little of what my boys would call this generality jazz. Under heads and subheads, let's take food as we have found it. It is more than possible that in the cities we have passed through, traffic harried, there are good and distinguished restaurants with menus of delight. But in the eating places along the roads, the food has been clean, tasteless, colorless, and of a complete sameness. It is almost as though the customers had no interest in what they ate as long as it had no character to embarrass them. This is true of all but the breakfasts, which are uniformly wonderful if you stick to bacon and eggs and pan-fried potatoes. At the roadsides, I never had a really good dinner or a really bad breakfast. The bacon or sausage was good and packaged at the factory, the eggs fresh or kept fresh by refrigeration, and refrigeration was universal. I might even say roadside America is the paradise of breakfast, except for one thing. Now and then I would see a sign that said homemade sausage or home smoked bacons and hams or new laid eggs, and I would stop and lay in supplies. Then cooking my own breakfast and making my own coffee, I found that the difference was instantly apparent. A freshly laid egg does not taste remotely like the pale, battery-produced refrigerated egg. The sausage would be sweet and sharp and pungent with spices, and my coffee a wine dark happiness. Can I then say that the America I saw has put cleanliness first at the expense of taste? And since all our perceptive nerve trunks, including that of taste, are not only perfectible, but also capable of trauma, that the sense of taste tends to disappear, and that strong, pungent, or exotic flavors arouse suspicion and dislike, and so are eliminated. It's an interesting little thought there for 1960-61. Strong, pungent, or exotic flavors arouse suspicion and dislike, and so are eliminated. Interesting. But let's go a little farther into other fields, Charley. Let's take the books, magazines, and papers we have seen displayed where we have stopped. The dominant publication has been the comic book. There have been local papers, and I've bought and read them. There have been racks of paperbacks with some great and good titles, but overwhelmingly outnumbered by the volumes of sex, sadism, and homicide. The big city papers can cast their shadows over large areas around them. The New York Times as far as the Great Lakes, the Chicago Tribune all the way here to North Dakota. Here, Charley, I give you a warning should you be drawn to generalities. If this people has so atrophied its taste buds as to find tasteless food not only acceptable, but desirable, What of the emotional life of the nation? Do they find their emotional fare so bland that it must be spiced with sex and sadism through the medium of the paperback? And if this is so, why are there no condiments save ketchup and mustard to enhance their foods? So this is a very interesting little thing he's doing. He's looking at what people read as being very spicy, and then looking at the food they eat as being very bland and without any spice other than ketchup or mustard. So that's a very interesting thing that he's pointing to here. We've listened to local radio all across the country, and apart from a few reportings of football games, the mental fare has been as generalized, as packaged, and as undistinguished as the food. I stirred Charley with my foot to keep him awake. I had been keen to hear what people thought politically. Well, he should be living during this time then, because you can't not help it. Those whom I had met did not talk about the subject. It didn't seem to want to talk about it. It seemed to me partly caution and partly a lack of interest, but strong opinions were just not stated. One storekeeper did admit to me that he had to do business with both sides and could not permit himself the luxury of an opinion. He was a graying man in a little gray store, a crossroads place where I stopped for a box of dog biscuits and a can of pipe tobacco. This man, this store might have been anywhere in the nation, but actually it was back in Minnesota. The man had a kind of gray, wistful twinkle in his eyes, as though he remembered humor when it was not against the law, so that I dared go out on a limb. I said, quote, "It looks then as though the natural contentiousness of people had died, but I don't believe that. It'll just take another channel. Can you think, sir, of what that channel might be?" And he said, "You mean where will they bust out?" Yes, where do they bust out? I was not wrong. The twinkle was there, the precious, humorous twinkle. "Well, sir," he said, "we've got a murder now and then, or we can read about them. Then we've got the World Series. You can raise a wind anytime over the Pirates or the Yankees. But I guess the best of all is we've got the Russians." "Feelings pretty strong there?" I asked. "Oh, sure. Hardly a day goes by somebody doesn't take a belt at the Russians." For some reason, he was getting a little easier, even permitted himself a chuckle that could have turned to throat clearing if he saw a bad reaction from me. I asked, "Anybody know any Russians around here?" And now he went all out and laughed. "Of course not. That's why they're valuable. Nobody can find fault with you if you take out after the Russians." Although now I'd say in this country, it's the really liberal take out after the conservatives, and the conservatives take out at the liberals, and everybody still kind of takes out at the Russians too, I guess. Because we're not doing business with them. He picked up a cheese knife from the counter and carefully ran his thumb along the edge and laid the knife down. "Maybe that's it, by George. Maybe that's it. We're not doing business with Russians." "You think then we might be using the Russians as an outlet for something else, for other things?" "I didn't think that at all, sir, but I bet I'm going to. Why, I remember when people took everything out on Mr. Roosevelt. Andy Larson got red in the face about Roosevelt one time when his hens got the croup." "Yes, sir," he said with growing enthusiasm. "Those Russians got quite a load to carry. Man has a fight with his wife, he belts the Russians." "Well, maybe everybody needs Russians. I'll bet even in Russia, they need Russians. Maybe they call them Americans." He cut a sliver of cheese from a wheel and held it out to me on the knife blade. "You've given me something to think about in a sneaky kind of way." "I thought you gave it to me." "How?" he asked. "About business and opinions." "Well, maybe so. Know what I'm going to do? Next time Andy Larson comes in red in the face, I'm going to see if the Russians are bothering his hens. It was a great loss to Andy when Mr. Roosevelt died." Now, I don't say that an awful lot of people have this man's sense of things. Maybe they don't, but maybe they do. Also in their privacy or in non-business areas. All right, so in 1960-61, does anybody out there remember people always using the Russians? as an excuse or as something against, I don't know. I mean, I wasn't breathing then, so. Anybody have any thoughts on that? Russians?
I just remember that we were always sort of, they're coming, they're gonna come. And that was pretty much it up here in the Northwest. I don't think anybody talked about that I recall. But they were gonna come, and they were gonna come and get us. And kids in school, you know, dive under the desk and all of that stuff. But yeah, I don't remember any blames.
I think North Dakota was the site of missile sites.
Mm.
One of the sites of missile sites that would be used in a Cold War encounter. So perhaps people in North Dakota were more aware of Russians than other parts of the country. I don't
Because of,
remember Wisconsin.
Because of the stock load of weapons, perhaps.
Yeah.
And in the Northwest, you were told they were coming with, you know, it was more of a impending
Mhm.
possibility, but not so much a daily reaction.
Mhm.
Interesting. I mean, even in the 80s when I grew up, I mean, there was all these movies like Red Dawn and Spies Like Us, and it was always the Russians, you know, that were the supposed, you know, enemy during the Cold War times. But it is interesting to get his thoughts on this and where he's going. He's saying that the Americans are using the Russians to really not look at their own issues, which of course the 60s, so many of those issues would then explode onto the American scene, that maybe we had been using the Russians, and then all of a sudden we had to take a look at what was actually going on in our own country. He's kind of hinting at that without outright saying, which is interesting, because he's saying that this guy in where he is in North Dakota has both customers. So he has to kind of be apolitical because he has both customers. Well, Steinbeck wants everybody to read this book. so he can't necessarily in 1960 or 61 come out against either side. So
We have a question, Jake.
Not a question, but an observation. I was raised in North Dakota, and the town we lived in was mostly Russians, although they were called Russians all through the time I was there. But they were farmers that had come over, and most of them couldn't even speak English. We were probably the only Norwegians living in the same little village, and also a family of Jewish people at that time.
What brought them there? Pat?
What brought them there?
What brought them there?
What brought the Russians there?
What brought them? I think farmers in the countryside, lots of land there, and it was a pretty good country most of the time.
Anyone else have any questions or comments? Anything to share?
all right. Thank you for that discussion. Let's see. Charlie raised his head and roared a warning without bothering to get to his feet. Then I heard a motor approaching, and trying to get up, found my feet were long gone in sleep in the cold water. I couldn't feel them at all. While I rubbed and massaged them, and they awakened to painful pins and needles, a vintage sedan pulling a short coupled trailer like a box turtle lumbered down from the road and took a position on the water about 50 yards away. I felt annoyance at this invasion of my privacy, but Charlie was delighted. He moved on stiff legs with little delicate mincing steps to investigate the newcomer, and in the manner of dogs and people did not look directly at the object of his interest. If I seemed to be ridiculing Charlie, look you at what I was doing in the next half hour, and also what my neighbor was doing. Hold on, I'm gonna read that sentence again. That's a tough one. This is Steinbeck. He won the Pulitzer Prize, yet this sentence is, all right, this is the sentence. Hold on, where to go? If I seem to be ridiculing Charlie, comma, look you at what I was doing in the next half hour, and also what my neighbor was doing. Man, his feet really were asleep because there was no blood going in his head with that sentence. All right. Each of us went about our business with slow deliberateness, each being very careful not to stare at the other, and at the same time sneaking glances, appraising, evaluating. So here you have two guys in the middle of nowhere, each with their contraptions of moving about, trying to make it like they're not really interested in the other one because they're the only two people there and they don't want to seem too interested. I would have liked to watch that scene. He was dressed in olive drab trousers and a leather jacket, and he wore a cowboy hat, but with a flat crown and the brim curled and held to a peak by the chin strap. He had a classic profile, and even in the distance, I could see that he wore a beard that tied into his sideburns and so found his hair. My own beard is restricted to my chin. The air had grown quickly chill, and I don't know whether my head was cold or that I didn't want to remain uncovered in the presence of a stranger. At any rate, I put on my old naval cap, made a pot of coffee, and sat on my back steps, glancing with great interest at everything except my neighbor, who swept out his trailer and threw out a dishpan of soapy water while he pointedly unwatched me. Charlie's interest was captured and held by various growlings and barkings that came from inside the trailer. There must be in everyone a sense of proper and civil timing, for I had just resolved to speak to my neighbor. In fact, had just stood up to move toward him when he strolled toward me. He too had felt that the period of waiting was over. He moved with a strange gait reminiscent to me of something I couldn't place. There was a seedy grandeur about the man. Now that's a Steinbeck sentence right there. There was a seedy grandeur. That's a great adjective, great, beautiful. In the time of chivalric myth, this would be the beggar who turns out to be a king's son. As he came near, I stood up from my iron-back stoop to greet him. He did not give me a sweeping bow, but I had the impression that he might have, either that or a full regimental salute. Good afternoon, he said. I see you are of the profession. I guess my mouth fell open. It's years since I have heard the term. Well, no, I'm not. You know, funny thing, I gotta say this. When we read that out loud in my class, the one student's like, does that guy think he's a prostitute? I'm like, no, he does not think Steinbeck's a prostitute. He thinks he's an actor. So for anybody out there who thought that, shame on you. All right. I guess my mouth fell open. It's years since I have heard the term. Well, no, I'm not. Now it was his turn to look puzzled. Not. But my dear chap, if you're not, how do you know the expression? I guess I've been on the fringes. Ah, fringes, of course. Backstage, no doubt. Direction stage manager? Flops, I said. Would you like a cup of coffee? Delighted. He never let down. That's one nice thing about those of the professions. They rarely do. He folded himself on the divan seat behind my table with a grace I never achieved in all of my traveling. And I set out 2 plastic mugs and 2 glasses, poured coffee, and set a bottle of whiskey within easy reach. It seemed to me a mist of tears came into his eyes, but it might be that they were in mine. Flops, he said. Who hasn't known them, hasn't played? Shall I pour for you? Please do. No water. He cleared his palate with black coffee and then munched delicately on the whiskey while his eyes swept my abode. Nice place you have here. Very nice. Tell me, please, what made you think that I was in the theater? He chuckled dryly. Very simple, Watson. You know I've played that, both parts. Well, first I saw your poodle. And then I observed your beard. Then on approaching, I saw that you wore a naval cap with the British Royal Arms. Was that what broadened your A's? That might be, old chap. That certainly might be. I fall into such things, hardly knowing I'm doing it. Now, close up, I saw that he was not young. His movements were pure youth, but there was that about his skin texture and the edges of his lips that was middle-aged or past it. And his eyes, large, warm, brown irises set on whites that were turning yellow, corroborated this. Your health, I said, and we emptied our plastic glasses, chased with coffee, and I refilled. If it isn't too personal or too painful, what did you do in the theater? I wrote a couple of plays. Produced? Yes, they flopped. Would I know your name? I doubt it. Nobody else did. He sighed. It's a hard business, but if you're hooked, you're hooked. I was hooked by my granddaddy, and my daddy set the hook. Both were actors, and my mother and grandmother. Lord, that is show business. Are you, I searched for the old word, resting now? Not at all. I'm playing. What, for God's sake, and where? Wherever I can trap an audience, schools, churches, service clubs. I bring culture, give readings. I guess you can hear my partner over there complaining. He's very good too, part Airedale and part coyote. Steals the show when he feels like it. I began to feel delighted with this man. I didn't know such things still went on. Well, they don't, only some of the time. Have you been at it long? 3 years, less 2 months. And all over the country? Wherever 2 or 3 are gathered together. I hadn't worked for over a year, just tramped the agencies and casting calls and lived off my benefits. With me, there's no question of doing something else. It's all I know, all I have ever known. Once, long ago, there was a community of theater people on Nantucket Island. My daddy bought a nice lot there and put up a frame house. Well, I sold that and bought my outfit there, and I've been moving ever since, and I like it. I don't think I'll ever go back to the grind. Of course, if there should be a part, but hell, who'd remember me for a part? Any part. You're striking close to home there. Yeah, it's a hard business. I hope you won't think I'm inquisitive, even if I am. I'd like to know how you go about it. What happens? How do people treat you? Well, they treat me very well, and I don't know how I go about it. Sometimes I even have to rent a hall and advertise. Sometimes I speak to the principal of the high school. But aren't people scared of gypsies, vagabonds, and actors? Well, I guess they are at first. At the beginning, they take me for a kind of harmless freak. But I'm honest and I don't charge much, and after a little, the material takes over and gets into them. You see, I respect the material. That makes the difference. I'm not a charlatan. I'm an actor. Good or bad, an actor. His color had deepened with whiskey and vehemence, and perhaps at being able to talk to someone with a little likeness of experience. I poured more into his glass this time and watched with pleasure his enjoyment of it. He drank and sighed. Don't get something like this very often, he said. I hope I haven't given you the impression that I'm rolling in receipts. Sometimes it's a bit rough. Well, go on about it. Tell me more. Where was I? You were saying you respected your material and that you were an actor. Oh, yes. Well, there's one more thing. You know when show people come into what they call the sticks and they have a contempt for the yokels? It took me a little time. But when I learned that there aren't any yokels, I began to get on fine. I learned respect for my audience. They feel that and they work with me and not against me. Once you respect them, they can understand anything you can tell them. Now that would be some good advice for the world that we live in at the present. Once you respect them, they can understand. Interesting. Tell me about your material. What do you use? He looked down at his hands and I saw that they were well kept and very white, as though he wore gloves most of the time. Well, I hope you won't think I'm stealing material, he said. I admire the delivery of Sir John Gielgud. I heard him do his monologue of Shakespeare, The Ages of Man. And then I bought a record of it to study. What he can do with words, with tones and inflections. You use that? Yes, but I don't steal it. I tell people about hearing Sir John and what it did to me, and then I say I'm going to try to give an impression of how he did it. Clever. Well, it does help because it gives authority to the performance, and Shakespeare doesn't need billing. And that way I'm not stealing his material. It's like I'm celebrating him, which I do. And how do they respond? Well, I guess I'm pretty much at home with it now because I can watch the words sink in and they forget about me and their eyes kind of turn inward and I'm not a freak to them anymore. Well, what do you think? I think Gielgud would be pleased. Oh, I wrote to him and told him what I was doing and how I was doing it, a long letter. He brought a lumpy wallet from his hip pocket and extracted a carefully folded piece of aluminum foil, opened it, and with careful fingers unfolded a small sheet of notepaper with the name engraved at the top. The message was typed. It said, "Dear Sir, thank you for your kind and interesting letter. I would not be an actor if I were not aware of the sincere flattery implied in your work. Good luck and God bless you, John Gielgud." I sighed and I watched his reverent fingers fold the note and close it in its armor of foil and put it away. I never show that to anyone to get a show, he said. I wouldn't think of doing that. And I'm sure he wouldn't. He whirled his plastic glass in his hand and regarded the rinse of whiskey left in it, a gesture often designed to draw emptiness to the attention of a host. I uncorked the bottle. No, he said, no more for me. I learned long ago that the most important and valuable of acting techniques is the exit. But I'd like to ask more questions. All the more reason for the exit. He drained the last drop. Keep them asking, he said, and exit clean and sharp. Thank you, and good afternoon. I watched him swing lightly toward his trailer, and I knew I would be haunted by one question. So I called him out. Wait a moment. He paused and turned back to me. What does the dog do? A couple of silly tricks, he said. He keeps the performance simple. He picks it up when it goes stale. And he continued on to his home. So it went on. A profession older than writing and one that will probably survive when the written word has disappeared. And all the sterile wonders of movies and television and radio will fail to wipe it out. A living man in communication with a living audience. But how did he live? Who were his companions? What was his hidden life? He was right. His exit whetted the questions. So I want to ask you about that section because a lot of my students always say, why did he put that in there? I, for one, really like it because I think it brings out a lot of Steinbeck's hidden qualities through this other man. It also brings out another quality of art that is disappearing, in the world, which is this kind of vagabond type of actor who just goes around playing these little, carnivals, fairs, community centers, schools, and just does this for a living, right? This kind of tramp gypsy lifestyle. And so I like that part, but I'm open to other things. So I have a question. Did you like that part? Did you feel that it didn't belong? What are your thoughts on that part of the book? Because I usually get a lot of strong opinions on it.
Well, I remember in our small town having programs by people who just came through, maybe at the auditorium at the school, and a lot of adults in the community would come for them too, even though it was during the school hours.
So it was a way to bring in a greater culture
Right.
into a town.
Right. Often they had animals. One that I specifically remember was a man who had trained wild river otters and brought them. He gave this wonderful talk about the otters and the river and the animals that lived in and around it. And then he had the live otters with him. You could actually, at the end of the show, go up and touch them. And it was exciting in a small town.
So this part made sense to you then?
Yes. And I'm also reminded of the novel News of the World. I don't know if you've read that, but
I saw the movie.
Okay, well, the book is very good, and, you know, the man does the same thing of going around and bringing the outside world to these communities that aren't in touch. I think it's very moving.
Anybody out there in the auditorium have any thoughts on this a specific section of the book? Did you have any kind of performances like that where you grew up or anything?
I see shrugging shoulders and shaking heads. Oh, hold on.
No, it just, you were asking about if we thought that was necessary to be a part of it, and I just thought it just flowed right in with all the characters that he met along the way. This one was especially interesting, I thought, and it was conceivable to me that you would meet a character like that when you're a vagabond type life. Yeah, I like that. Thanks.
I wonder if it's a, you know, I wonder if it's a generational thing, because I have to say, like, my college age students don't get that part at all. And I always wonder why, but they can't fathom somebody going around doing that when you could just do it on YouTube. So I think that they can't fathom that somebody would travel to do something that you could just post and get 1 million views in like an hour. So I think it could be a technological generational thing, because I too really love this piece because I think it's very human piece. But if you know, if you don't see that as being a reality, then I guess, you know, does that make sense? I don't know.
Yes, yeah. I mean, he says a living man connecting with a living audience. Yes,
Right.
that's certainly very different from today.
Right. Yes. Yeah, there you go. A living human being and a living audience, rather than a human being putting something that somebody looks at a screen and there's no actual communication between two
Right.
living people.
And there's no way for that performer on the screen to read how his audience is reacting to what he's doing, except in a chat or a comment. It's
Except
a very
lot of
different kind
passive
of
aggressive
experience.
comments, yes. Yeah, no, that's very true, right? And he says he can watch the audience go from looking at him as kind of like a harmless freak to actually interiorizing the words of the theater and then having an introspective moment. And he can see this. And that's really a conversation between the actor and the audience. So that's why I do think this is a really important section of the book, because it speaks to something that is disappearing. And he thought it was disappearing in 1960, 61. This is 66, just about 60 years later, and it is disappearing. So that's very interesting. All right, we got a little bit of time left, and let's see. I won't be able to finish this whole section, but we'll start a little bit. The night was loaded with omens. The grieving sky turned the little water to a dangerous metal, and then the wind got up, not the gusty, rabbity wind of the seacoasts I know, but a great bursting sweep of wind with nothing to inhibit it for 1,000 miles in any direction. And actually, I'm going to tell you a personal story about this, because I've gone across country 10 times in my life, but a few of the first times was camping. And me and my friend Steve were doing a trip from, well, it began in Florida, went up to Ottawa, Canada, then it went out to Portland, Oregon, then to Washington State, then it ended in Detroit. But when we were out in, must have been South Dakota, we found this campground, and it was getting dark, and we pitched our tent, and then this wind, you know, we just had a little 2-person tent, 3-season, and then this wind started to really kick up. We were the only people at this campground in the middle of nowhere. And we had this kind of, you know, transistor radio that my grandfather had given me a long time ago, just to listen to news reports. And as the wind got worse, I said, you know, Steve, we should probably just check to see, like, if anything's going on, because nobody knows where we are. There's probably nobody within miles of us. And we finally got to a local radio station, and there was a tornado. And we're like, well, where are we, right? So we like run out to the street, and we're looking for signs, and we finally found a little thing that said the name of the place we were camping, and what town it was in. And anyway, we got out our map of North Dakota or whatever, and we found out that the tornado was in like the area that we were in. And so we folded up the tent, got in the car, which, I mean, who knows what should have done this or not. And we just started driving, listening to the radio, trying to get anywhere away from where the tornado was. But I remember for the next hour, we were just like, because there was nothing to impede the wind. And that's what he's saying here. Like it just, everything was flat. And so no matter where we went, we just felt like we were kind of sitting ducks. Because it was a wind strange to me and therefore mysterious, it set up mysterious responses in me. In terms of reason, it was strange only because I found it so. But a goodly part of our experience, which we find inexplicable, must be like that. To my certain knowledge, many people conceal experiences for fear of ridicule. How many people have seen or heard or felt something which so outraged their sense of what should be that the whole thing was brushed quickly away like dirt under a rug? For myself, I try to keep the line open, even for things I can't understand or explain, but it is difficult in this frightened time. At this moment in North Dakota, I had a reluctance to drive on that accounted to fear. At the same time, Charley wanted to go, in fact, made such a commotion about going that I tried to reason with him. Listen to me, dog. I have a strong impulse to stay, amounting to celestial command. If I should overcome it and go, and a great snow should close in on us, I would recognize it as a warning disregarded. If we stay and a big snow should come, I would be certain I had a pipeline to prophecy. Charley sneezed and paced restlessly. All right, mon cure, let's take your side of it. You want to go on. Suppose we do. And in the night, a tree should crash down right where we are presently standing. It would be you who have the attention of the gods. And there is always that chance. I could tell you many stories about faithful animals who saved their masters, but I think you are just bored and I'm not going to flatter you. He's talking to his dog. Charley leveled at me his most cynical eye. I think he is neither a romantic nor a mystic. I know what you mean. If we go and no tree crashes down or stay and no snow falls, what then? I'll tell you what then. We forget the whole episode and the field of prophecy is in no way injured. I vote to stay, you vote to go. But being nearer the pinnacle of creation than you and also president, I cast the deciding vote. So we stayed, and it didn't snow and no tree fell, so naturally we forgot the whole thing and are wide open for more mystic feelings when they come. And in the early morning, swept clean of clouds and telescopically clear, we crunched around on the thick white ground cover of frost and got underway. The caravan of the arts was dark, but the dog barked as we ground up to the highway. So again, like it inevitably happens that all of Steinbeck's fears come to the fore at night, and usually during inclement weather. It's a common theme throughout this book. And of course, it starts with the prelude of the Hurricane Donna, when he's still at home. And so there's this constant theme in the book of nighttime, inclement weather, and being alone. And then the morning, the sun, the light, clarity, everything is cleared up. So that's a common theme throughout the course of the book, weather. And another common theme is traffic and traffic choked streets. Whereas even when he goes to Fargo, and it's only a town of 46,000 people, it's still traffic choked. And there's lots of cars whizzing about. And at this time in his life, Steinbeck is yearning for rural, bucolic, empty spaces and just clarity. So anytime he's in a bustling, crowded, traffic choked, or unclear weather, he gets a little bit nervous or fearful. So it's an interesting psychological depth that's in this book. He's just yearning for clear, open spaces. And unfortunately for him, throughout the book, he keeps ending up sometimes in these traffic choked or unclear places. So it's an interesting, again, subcurrent of the book, what we call a literary device, something that he constantly brings back into the fore over and over again to explain his inner psychology. He uses exterior or external descriptions. So any thoughts or questions about what we just read? We have a couple minutes left. We are now on page 113. Anything?
Well, I've been following along in our road atlas, and it seems to me that he's on the main road through North Dakota, or at least. So if he wants bucolic, he needs to get off that road.
Yeah. And, one of the things too is he's trying to make it across the country to get to California. Well, he goes to Washington State first. Actually, there'll be a big part there on Seattle. He goes there, he goes down through Oregon, and then he goes to California because he eventually has to get back to Texas for Thanksgiving. So part of the thing is he has sort of a schedule because he has to get all the way to the Pacific Northwest, all the way down the West Coast, and then back to Texas in time to meet his wife at her family's place in Texas for Thanksgiving. So he does sacrifice some bucolic timelessness to take traffic choked interstates because of that schedule. That was one of the few constrictions he had, was meeting his wife in Chicago and then eventually having to meet her again for Thanksgiving. So he just had to work around those two things. But one of the things for anybody out there who reads travel pieces or travel memoirs is that a lot of times an author will use specific exterior things over and over again to reflect an interior state or psychological state. So the external, especially if they keep coming back to something, is to provide a metaphorical or symbolic nature to an inner emotion or psychological feeling.
I have a question. You're talking about travel. Have you yourself written a book? Because I have a feeling it would be very interesting.
Have I? Yes, several. Yeah, many.
About your travel. I'd love to read it. Or them.
Yeah, but I write under two names. One, my real name, but my probably most read book is under a pen name. But the name of the book is Blue Collar Nomad. And it's about 12 years. It's a collection of essays about 12 years that I spent living and working throughout North America, just doing different kind of blue collar work so that I could keep traveling. So bucking firewood, picking apples, picking blueberries, creating gardens, bartending, waitering, dishwasher, pizza maker, you name it. I probably did it. So the book uses that as a lens to talk about place. And it's also, I spent a lot of time with a lot of marginalized people. So the book goes into a lot about the marginalized people that I spent time with as well.
And what is your pen name?
My pen name is Jake Kaida. So Jake is I've always been called Jake as a nickname, but Kaida was given to me by a Japanese gardener and it means little dragon.
How do you spell that?
Kaida.
K-A.
And I also read under my own name, Paul W. Jacobs. So I've had a couple of books on, and all my books deal with place, spirituality, but mostly place and location, and the people that inhabit those places.
Thank you.
Thank you.
To check it out.
Yeah.
You never know what you'll find.
Yeah.
All right, well, we have journeyed pretty far in this book. So next week we will start off on page 113 in my book and continue on through the Dakotas, and eventually we will get to Seattle, and he has very interesting things to say about Seattle. So that'll be interesting how you all take that.
All right. Well, thanks for starting our week off so wonderfully.
Yeah.
And have a great week yourself.
All right, take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.